Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile found...
They move like wraiths in the angled corners of darkness. They are wanton agents of the night. These are the monstrous false reflections of life, desiring only to feed on the life essence of man. They are the devil's undead. They are shadow dwellers, Nosferatu. Blackwater Media and the Shadowland Radio Show presents The Vampire Show. In the spring of 1727, Arnold Paoli returned from service in the military to settle in his hometown of Medwegna, near Belgrade. He bought some land, built a home, and established himself in the community. After a short time, he was betrothed to a local girl whose father's land bordered his, and the two were wed. Paoli told his wife that he was haunted by fears of an early death. In the military, he had been stationed in Greece. Local beliefs were that the dead come back to haunt the living in the form of revenants or vampires. While he was stationed there, he told his wife he had been visited by an undead being. Afterwards, he hunted down the unholy grave from which the undead being had come, as was the local custom. He extracted his revenge upon the vampire by burning the corpse. However, the incident affected him so greatly that against the advice of his superior officers, he resigned from the military and came back to Medwegna. Shortly after his marriage, Paoli fell from a great height while working on the farm and was brought unconscious back to his home. He must have sustained internal injuries with the fall, for within a few days, Paoli died and was buried in the town cemetery. A month after he died, there were several reports from people around the township who had seen Paoli. A few had even seen him in their own home, although these reports do not clearly state what he did while in these homes. For the most part, however, there was little panic stemming from these reports until a short time later. Several weeks after the initial reports, most of the people who had claimed Paoli had visited their home turned up dead for inexplicable reasons, and a group was assembled to exhume the body of Paoli. The group consisted of 2 military officers, 2 army surgeons, and a priest from the local church. When the group exhumed the body, they found a fresh corpse. There was no decomposition of the body whatsoever, and in fact the old skin and nails had fallen off and new ones had grown to take their place. The final insult was the fresh blood that rested on the lips of the deceased Paoli. When one member of the group staked the body, it cried out and fresh blood spilled from the wound. The group scattered garlic around the remains and did the same to each of the graves whereto Paoli had sent his newest victims. All was quiet in Medwegna for several years until 1732, when there was another spate of inexplicable deaths. This time the town took no chances and immediately sent out a group to the graveyard to investigate. The resultant report has ended up in many history books over time. It was signed by 3 renowned Army surgeons and co-signed by a lieutenant colonel and a sub-lieutenant. Of all the bodies they disinterred during the investigation, they once again found no less than 11 corpses, which displayed the same marked traits as the Paoli corpse. No decomposition, although many had been interred several months previous to their inquiry. Fresh skin grown, fresh blood in the arteries and in the heart. The complete medical report is available in many modern vampire histories. No explanation has been given for the latter outbreak of vampirism, although one theory holds that Paoli had feasted on local cattle as well as people during his vampiric reign. Then the theory states, as time passed and the cows were killed for their meat, the vampire qualities were passed on to anyone who ate the meat. Evidence of the Alnwick vampire was collected by William of Newburgh, who collected a variety of accounts of vampires in England. One incident that occurred during his own lifetime concerned a man who served the Lord of Alnwick Castle in the 12th century. The servant, who was known for his wicked ways, was plagued by an unfaithful wife. Having hidden on the roof above his bed to see her actions for himself, he fell to the ground and died the next day from his injuries. Following his burial, the man was seen wandering through the town. People became afraid of encountering him and locked themselves in their houses after dark each day. During this time, an epidemic broke out and a number of people died. The sickness was blamed on the vampire. Finally, on Palm Sunday, the local priest assembled a group of more devout residents and some of the leading citizens who proceeded to the cemetery. They dug up the body, which appeared gorged with blood that gushed when struck with a spade. Having decided that the body had fed off the blood of many victims, it was dragged out of town and burned. Soon after, the epidemic ended, and the town returned to normal. Alnwick Castle is the second largest inhabited castle in England, and has been the home of the Percys, Earls, and Dukes of Northumberland since 1309. The castle has most recently been used for the filming of Harry Potter. It is located in the town of the same name in the English county of Northumberland. Peter Plagojewicz was a farmer in the village of Kisolava, Serbia. In 1725, Plagojewicz died, but he didn't remain dead. 3 days after his death, Plagojewicz returned from the grave and appeared before his son, demanding food. His son fed him, but the next night when Plagojewicz reappeared asking for more food, the son refused him. It is said that Plagojewicz left his son, but the next morning the son was found dead. After a few days, 9 more people from the village were found dead. Before the death, each villager complained of exhaustion and appeared to have lost blood. They also all claimed to have had dreams of being visited by Plagojewicz. Plagojewicz's wife even claimed that he came to her asking for his shoes. She was so scared that she left the village. The parish priest became alarmed, so he wrote to the local magistrate, who passed the news to a nearby commander of imperial troops. He, 2 officers, and an executioner arrived after receiving the message and exhumed the corpse of Plagojewicz and all who had died. Plagojewicz's corpse was preserved and his mouth was covered in blood. A stake was pounded into Plagojewicz's chest and blood gushed everywhere. The body was then burned to ash on a pyre. The other bodies were reburied with garlic and white thorn in each corpse. In the English-speaking world today, vampires are perhaps most famously associated with the region of Transylvania in Romania, thanks to Bram Stoker's gothic horror novel Dracula. Nevertheless, stories of vampires also exist in other cultures, and one of these stories comes from the southeastern European country of Croatia. It is from this Balkan state that we receive the story of Yuri Grando, said to be the first documented case of vampirism in Europe. Yuri Grando is recorded to have lived in a small Istrian village called Kringa during the 17th century. It seems that little is known about Grando's life, and he may have just been an ordinary villager prior to his death. Some sources claim that he was a nasty character. In 1656, Grando died and is said to have been buried in a local cemetery by the village priest, Father Giorgio. Shortly after Grando's burial, however, it was reported by the local population that the deceased had been seen wandering around the village and even knocking on the doors of certain houses. According to the 17th century Carniolan natural historian Johann Weichard von Valvassor, the people living in the countryside of the Istrian Peninsula believed in a type of vampire known as strigon. These are believed to have been sorcerers who fed on the blood of children during their lifetimes. When they died, they became the undead strigon and wandered around their villages around midnight. The strigon is also said to have a habit of knocking on doors of houses, and within a few days, someone from the house would die. It seems that Valvassor's description fits the story of Yuri Grando, or perhaps derived from it. Valvassor goes on to say that if a person died during the period when the strigon was sighted, it was generally believed by the other villagers that he or she had been eaten by the undead creature. Valvassor also wrote that the villagers believed that the strigon had the ability to silently creep into their beds to sleep with their women. According to the natural historian, the villagers also believed that the strigon had a taste for widows, especially if they were young and beautiful. It was this firm belief in the nefarious activities of the strigon that caused fear amongst the villagers, causing them to seek out the creature in order to kill it. In the case of Yuri Grando, the vampire is said to have terrorized his village for 16 years before action was taken against him. In 1672, the mayor of the village, Miho Radetic, gathered a group of brave young men to hunt Grando down and to put an end to his reign of terror. The men, 9 in total, went to the local cemetery and opened Grando's grave. The men are said to have seen that the dead man's body was still intact, which was taken as a sign of vampirism. In one version of the story, the men fled in fear, but they rallied together and, led by the mayor, went back to Grando's grave. Next, the men or the priest, who was one of the 9, tried to get rid of the vampire by invoking the name of Jesus Christ. This seemed to be of no avail. The group then tried to stab the vampire in the stomach with a wooden stake. This too did not work, as the stake could not pierce through its target. Finally, one of the men, said to be named Stephen Milasic, in one source beheaded Grando with an axe. The vampire is said to have given out a loud cry, and blood gushed forth from the neck. The men then covered the grave again, and that was the end of Yuri Grando. And that concludes the Shadowland Radio Show's special presentation of The Vampire Show. Thank you for listening. The Shadowland Radio Show can be heard exclusively on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester, and I promise to see each and every one of you again on the flip side. Orasti, Romania, 1992. The villagers rarely ventured far beyond their doors after dark. Only the very bravest among them would dare do so. From time to time, some of the men would return from hunting in the nearby forests or fishing in the streams and isolated waterways, just as the sun made its regular pilgrimage to plunge the world into darkness. On a hill leading out of the village was a cemetery, incredibly old. I found it strange that standing at the entrance I would delight at the charm of the place and at the same time be taken by a sense of dread, the likes of which I had never experienced. As I meandered through the graveyard, I tried desperately to alleviate the sense of apprehension that had taken hold of me. I would stop here and there and read the inscriptions, translating into English in my head as best I could the sentiments of the loved ones who had prescribed them. I actually heard the sound of water splashing before I saw the fountain. Then, moments later, she appeared, wraith-like at first, but then more tangible. The sight of her disgusted me, and at the same time drew me wildly. Though she was indeed a vile visage, I could sense her projecting images of wanton desire. And it is true that as I stood there transfixed, she uttered these words, "Can you love me?" She had a frightening animal quality about her, and in truth, there were moments when parts of her seemed almost transparent. I remembered that the Archbishop had spoken of such creatures, which exist in anti-time, a state of transdimensional flux. She made a move forward, and I reached inside my jacket for an Ethiopian crucifix that had been recently liberated from a Syrian smuggler. But that's another story. Her eyes widened and flared as she shrieked at me in Latin, "Ego te provoco," which is to say, "I dare you." I took it as a challenge, and on the part of the creature, an admission of fear and apprehension. Somehow this brokered a subtle smile from me, and at the sight of this, the dead thing evidenced a seething anger that radiated into rage. It spat out more Latin, translated as, "Your timid Nazarene is weak and powerless to help you." She moved forward again as I withdrew the amulet. The creature continued to rage at me in Latin, and I will translate it as, "The self-important fool in his arrogance thought that he could save your wretched kind. And how did his God reward him? With a shameful death, hanging naked in the sun like the worthless magician that he was." And then I moved forward. As I moved forward, the thing recoiled and spat out a horrible reptilian hiss. Her shoulders and back seemed to arch in a hideous, contorted display. She backed herself against the stone of the fountain and displayed the most horrid, feral set of teeth imaginable. Aside from two spike-like incisors, her mouth was studded with what could only be described as 2 rows of shark-like teeth. As I moved closer to the thing, the fear in its eyes became evident. Backed against the stone of the fountain, it attempted, in a lizard-like manner, to climb the structure. I then uttered these words: "I am a servant of Ra and of Athena. I am a son of the earth. By the blood of the Nazarene you are banished forever from the soil of the earth. Your feet may not trod upon this world again." At this, her form became more and more distorted, as if she could not maintain cohesion. She seemed to melt into the stonework and then into nothing. As she did so, there was one last wrenching scream of spite and resignation. In exhaust and terror, I fell to one knee and was only barely able to maintain consciousness. My next memory is of the morning sun's light spraying into my eyes. I awoke to the sound of the splashing water of the fountain and the scent of earth, grass, and to my delight, the scent of very strong coffee wafting down from the village. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. She was nervous when her husband said that they were to stay in the abandoned house, for it contained the corpse of the hermit who once lived there, enshrined in a coffin in the loft. It was an old custom and one no longer popular among the Iroquois people, but the hermit had insisted upon it before his death. There was good hunting in this place, her man had declared, and so they moved in, and she unpacked their few belongings in the front room, refusing to go up into the loft where the hermit's body lay. When her husband left to hunt, she immediately put her daughter in the sling on her back and went to look for roots and berries, staying away until her husband returned with the meat. As she prepared the evening meal for them, her husband, tired from his hunting, climbed up into the loft to rest. The hut soon filled with the delicious smell of roasting meat. She was sorting through the berries when she heard a muffled cry and the crunch of breaking bones. As she stared upward, frozen in horror, blood started to drip from the rafters. She crept silently to the far corner of the room where she could see up into the loft. A skeleton with glowing red eye sockets was feasting on the body of her husband, its teeth and chin covered with blood. Her daughter stirred restlessly at her back, and she knew that she had to get away immediately. "I'm going to run down to the stream to fetch water for the broth," she called toward the loft. "I'll be right back." She took the pail and walked toward the stream, trying to appear normal. As soon as she was out of sight among the trees, she started to run as fast as she could. She heard a terrible howl from the direction of the house as the creature heard them escaping and started to pursue. The young mother stumbled desperately through the woods, the creature's howls growing closer as it pursued them. Her little daughter wailed in fright at her back, as she fled in terror, sobbing, and was almost without hope. The monster was gaining on her. In a last act of despair, she shouted the Iroquois distress cry, hoping someone would be near enough to hear it. Her call was taken up and answered by warriors from the village. She could hear the creature breathing behind her as she sprinted to the trees at the edge of the village. Here, her strength failed her, and she collapsed to the ground. Just before the monster could pounce on them, a party of warriors burst through the gates of the village, chasing the skeleton away. They swung their torches wide, and the skeleton retreated farther into the woods. The warriors chased the creature back to the hermit's house and set fire to the cabin. As the flames encompassed the house, a terrible howling and roaring came from the loft, and the vampire hermit fled into the woods in the form of a rabbit, never again to plague the young woman or her daughter. Good evening. It's a pleasure to have you all join me once again. I hope that each of you somehow, someway are able to make yourselves comfortable, but I doubt if that's a real possibility, especially when you learn what's in store for you. Tonight, we visit the continent of Africa, birthplace of civilization and of mankind itself. It is a place steeped in legend, lore, and myth. These, of course, occasionally intersect with the darkest nightmares imaginable. Our tale tonight is one such example. I offer you now the Vampire of Kari Hall, who, by the way, has recently taken up residence on the Nightfall radio show. Kari Hall in Shindam, Nigeria, had been owned by a family named Sonsoro for well over 100 years. But at the end of the last century, they moved out to a larger estate in Zungeru and rented the house out to two brothers, Rano and Tarka Azari, and their sister Dia. The threesome settled comfortably into the house and soon made many friends in the surrounding area. One hot day in the middle of July, the sultry air made any kind of work impossible, so the three had an early supper. Afterward, they had all sat out on the porch, relaxing in the cooler air, and watched the beautiful full moon rise and wash the lawn in silver light. After a few hours, they grew tired and went indoors, each to their separate rooms. Dia found the night still too warm to sleep. She rose and opened her shutters, returned to the bed, mounted her pillows behind her, and sat up in bed, watching the moon through her ground floor window. After a time, she began to feel herself drifting off when she became aware of two tiny lights that seemed to flicker in and out of the row of trees that separated Kari Hall's lawn from the village mosque yard beyond. At first, they seemed little more than fireflies, but as Dia continued to stare at them, they drew nearer. She saw to her surprise that they appeared to be enclosed in a dark mass of shadow, which had somehow broken away from the moon-cast shadows beneath the trees. Dia's hand went to her throat as she realized that something was approaching the house, and growing larger the nearer it came. She noticed that every few moments the dark mass was engulfed by the shadows of trees on the lawn, but then the mass always re-emerged, larger than the previous moment, and always coming closer and closer. Closer. Dia became filled with horror and felt as though she would cry out, but her throat felt paralyzed. Then she realized that any noise that she might make would almost certainly draw the attention of the thing outside. Then she realized something else. Whatever was out there would surely not be stopped by a barrier of glass panes and thin wooden sashes. Then suddenly the mysterious shape turned aside as if it were going around the other side of the house. As soon as Dia determined that the menacing figure was out of sight, she leaped from her bed and ran to the hall door. But when her fingers grasped the cool brass knob, she heard a blood-chilling scratch at the window. When she turned, she beheld a hideous pale face with burning red eyes glaring back at her. The creature began rattling the windows, which were locked from the inside. For a hopeful instant, and only that long, Dia believed that the doors might actually keep the thing at bay. But as the rattling grew into a more fervent attempt at entry, Dia resigned to the fact that escape might be a more viable alternative. She tried to open the bedroom door to flee out into the hall beyond, but the antique handle jammed, leaving her trapped in the room. The creature outside began scratching on the glass, pecking its talon-like nails on the frail panes. Then it started ripping away the lead frames which held the glass in place. Dia tried to scream, but fear would only allow a pitiful moan to escape from her lips. Then, one single diamond-shaped pane fell inward and shattered on the floor. An incredibly long, spiny finger slunk through and found the latch on the window and threw it open. Now possessed only by the most potent horror, Dia jumped from the bed to which she had retreated upon discovering the jammed door. She hoped to reach the closet, but her resolve was too little, too late. The thing exploded into the room, grabbed her by the hair with its bony fingers, and flung her down onto the bed in such a way that her head hung over the side. Then, in a moment of savage cunning, evil, and terror, the thing bit her on the throat. The stinging pain released her voice, and she at last began to scream. As she fought and struggled to push the monstrous form away from her, she could hear her brothers shouting and pounding on the door. When Rano and Tarka saw that the door would not budge, they slammed themselves against it, throwing it down by sheer force. Inside, they found their sister bleeding from the wound in her throat and unconscious. They looked outside past the open window and saw nothing. Suddenly Rano shouted, "I see him!" He pointed to the tall figure that fled from the shadows under the large Iroko. Without hesitation, he pursued it, but the creature moved incredibly fast, with long, loping strides, and leaped over the wall into the mosque yard. By the time Rano had reached the fieldstone wall, he saw nothing save the gravestones and vaults. The thing, whatever it was, had vanished into the night. Frustrated and angry, he returned to his sister's room. There he discovered that Dia had regained consciousness, while Tarka applied a damp towel to her throat wound. "We'll keep watch the rest of the night," said Tarka. "In the morning, we'll take the first train back to Ado Ikiti." "Rano!" Dia shouted. "Did you find out who or what attacked me?" "No," Rano confessed. "It escaped into the mosque yard. But whatever it was, Tarka is right. We must leave here as quickly as possible." But Dia began shaking her head. "I won't let this drive us from our house in which we've been so happy." Rano and Tarka tried to persuade her to leave, but still she refused. "We've leased this house for 5 years," she said, "and we've been here less than 1. We can't afford to move elsewhere while paying rent on this place." Her brothers reluctantly agreed, and next morning the local constable helped them decide when he suggested it must have been a lunatic escaped from some asylum. Then he added with great authority, "He's not likely to return." So they stayed at Kari Hall, but Rano and Dia switched rooms. Dia kept her shutters closed fast at night. Both Rano and Tarka kept loaded pistols nearby. Winter came and went without incident. One night, sometime around the middle of March, Dia was suddenly awakened by a dreadful scratching at her shutters. When she looked up, she saw the same gruesome, pale, shriveled face staring back at her. She screamed as loud as she could, and her brothers dashed out of the house with their pistols drawn. Tarka spotted the creature loping across the lawn and fired. The lead ball lodged firmly into the thing's left leg, and the force of the impact sent the monster sprawling, but it quickly recovered and scrambled over the graveyard wall. But this time, Rano and Tarka reached the wall in time to see the dark figure disappear into a neglected vault. The next day, in the company of the constable and several other local authorities, the vault was opened. Inside, they discovered that all of the coffins had been smashed and their contents strewn across the floor. Only one coffin lay intact, though its lid was loose. At the constable's instruction, Rano and Tarka raised the coffin lid. Dia gasped, for lying inside was the pale and withered figure that had twice appeared and attacked her at the hall. Then further investigation revealed that the left leg of the body had been damaged by a pistol shot. Now it is a fact that no one uttered the dreaded word vampire, though all knew full well that such was among them, and by common agreement they did the only thing that could permanently banish the evil that haunted them. They burned the body to ashes. After that, there were no more disturbances at Kari Hall. If you're enjoying the show, go on over to blackwatermedia.net and join the Swamp Hunter Society. Just click on the Become a Member tab on the menu, and for only $4.99 a month, you can have exclusive access to the finest paranormal, horror, and supernatural story narration content available anywhere. It's the ultimate digital audio exploration into mystery, magic, monsters, and myth. Become a Blackwater Media Swamp Hunter Society member today. Welcome once again to this rather unusual festival of fright. I've taken the liberty of dimming the lights and turning up the air conditioning to put a bit of a chill in the air in order to create the appropriate atmosphere. I'm about to take you on a journey some 2,000 years into the past. At first, the backdrop, and indeed the story itself, might seem familiar to you. This is Palestine in the 1st century, a time and place in which some rather extraordinary events unfolded, but not quite in the way you've been told. I offer you now Son of the Father, a horrifying odyssey duly registered here on the Nightfall Radio Show. The crowds feared him, but they knew that the Romans did as well, and so this was sufficient cause for them to clamor for his release. Like the other prisoner, he had been seen to work feats of magic, summoning storm clouds, conjuring spirits, raising the dead. No one knew from whence he came, and he seemed to move only in the shadowy folds of the night. Caiaphas had cajoled Pilate that it would serve the greater good. It would quiet the streets, and certainly this would please Tiberius. Then there was the added benefit of enraging Herod. Initially, they didn't know his name, for he had referred to himself only as the Son of the Father. In a mocking gesture, Pilate had inquired how that was said in Aramaic. His aide did the translation. Barabbas. As his shackles were loosened, the torches illuminating the hall captured his eyes, which seemed to explode in a blaze of power. He chanced to look over at the other prisoner. He thought it strange that this man, this fool from Nazareth, though condemned to Golgotha, looked upon him with pity. But now he was free, and his thirst demanded attention. The attending centurion unbolted the door, and the man exited the hall. Once he entered the darkened corridor, he dashed with preternatural speed through the courtyard and out into the windless black air. And it was thusly so. The Nazarene began his torturous journey to be crucified. And in the silent, cold hours just before dawn, a vampire stalked the alleyways and rooftops of Jerusalem. And that concludes another excursion into the darkness on the Nightfall Radio Show. Thank you for listening to the program. The Nightfall Radio Show can be heard exclusively on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. If you enjoy the show, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you would like to submit a short story, poem, or artwork, email your submission along with a brief bio to nightfallradioshow@mail.com. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. I'll see you again at nightfall.